Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first Read Ballarat event for 2021. I acknowledge the Wadawurrung people, who are the traditional owners of the land where I am, and the traditional owners across all the lands on which we're meeting tonight. I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and the Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here today. And I'm going to hand over to Reed, who's going to introduce Emina, our guest presenter for tonight.
We're absolutely thrilled to have Emina presenting with us today. A little bit of background on Emina. Emina worked in speech language pathology, education, child and adolescent psychiatry, and some time in public health as well. She's an adjunct lecturer in language and literacy at Trobe University. She's a research member of Trobe University Science of Language and Reading, or the SOLAR Lab. And she's also, just to add it into the mix, the head of English at Docklands Primary School. She's also worked as a professional learning provider and instructional coach in schools across Australia. And she's working with Anglicare Victoria in 2021 to deliver language and literacy intervention to adolescents in out-of-home care as part of a SOLAR Lab research project. I think that Emina is one of our country's finest communicators of research and its application to the classroom. And we're very fortunate to have you, Emina, speaking with us today about embedding explicit vocabulary instruction across grades and subjects. And so thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us today. With no further ado, I'm going to pass over to Emina.
Thank you, Reed. That's very kind. When you list off all those things that I'm doing, I start to realise, oh, that's why I actually feel tired. Sometimes we do too many things, don't we? I'm so thrilled to be with you, and I've really enjoyed being a part of a few Read Ballarat sessions last year. It's great to be a part of it and yeah, continue the conversation that I've been trying to have for the last few years, I guess, in schools about how we can be more explicit and deliberate in how we go about vocabulary instruction. Okay, so what am I going to cover? I'm going to talk about the importance of developing vocabulary. Why do we focus on it? I'm going to talk about common practices in vocabulary instruction. And just note here, when I say common practices, I don't necessarily mean best practice. So we'll unpack that a little bit more. Just because it's happening frequently in a lot of classrooms doesn't mean it's the way we want to go about things. I'm going to talk about something called robust vocabulary instruction and what it is, which words that we want to teach and some justifications for that. I'll talk a little bit about text selection and mapping our text to the curriculum, because we can't really talk about vocabulary instruction without talking about text, which is where we get all of our words from. We'll go through my version of how to plan and conduct a lesson. Doesn't mean it's perfect. It'll just give you some ideas about how to get started. Within that, I'm going to talk about how we can use some of the writing revolution techniques. I know a lot of Ballarat schools are keen on the writing revolution. So I'll talk about some of the ways I use some of those sentence level techniques to boost vocab instruction. Briefly, I'll talk about review and assessment. Briefly, I'll talk about deeper word study, and then we'll finish. So I think I've got about 40 slides to get through in about 50 minutes. So hold on for the ride. Why should we focus on vocabulary? I really enjoy this quote that's in the Bringing Words to Life book by Beck, McEwen and Kuchen. A large and rich vocabulary is the hallmark of an educated individual. Indeed, a large vocabulary repertoire facilitates becoming an educated person to the extent that vocabulary knowledge is strongly related to reading proficiency in particular and school achievement in general. So we've got two pretty strong rationales there. Vocabulary knowledge, or the more words we know, the better our reading proficiency, reading comprehension, and the better our school achievement in general. And we've got a fair few studies now that show a correlational relationship. So good reading comprehension and good vocabulary knowledge hang around together in the same space. But we've also got some causal data that shows that if you develop vocabulary knowledge, that will develop your vocabulary, your reading comprehension, and that will improve your school achievement. So why else should we focus on vocabulary? We know that vocabulary is one of the 5 keys to reading. So we've got phonemic awareness, phonics fluency, vocab, and reading comprehension. And we've known that these are the 5 key focus areas for reading instruction for about 20 or so years now. And if you want to read more about those, I really recommend the links that I've put in this slide. I'll make these slides available afterward, but we've got the National Reading Panel from the States, our National Inquiry into the Teaching of Literacy in Australia, and the Rose Report, which was the English Inquiry into the Teaching of Reading. So given vocabulary and reading comprehension are related, I want to read through this quote with you and discuss it a little bit. Reading comprehension is a notoriously complex and knotty construct. I think we can all agree with that. It is influenced by multiple sources of variation at the level of text, activity, and purpose for reading, as well as by individual skills related to knowledge of the linguistic system, general knowledge, and word-level processes. This quote always makes me laugh, actually, because you need really good reading comprehension to read a quote about reading comprehension. Oh, the irony. Okay, so we can agree reading comprehension is complex. The second part, where I've put all the bold text, is the most important part in terms of relating to this presentation. So within this complex picture of reading comprehension, vocabulary knowledge is recognised as the linchpin of reading comprehension, the central connection point between the word identification system and the comprehension system. So what's that saying? The first step in reading is developing our word level reading ability. So in the early years, we're thinking about decoding, being able to blend sounds together to read whole words. And we do that enough times and we have repeated and extended practice. And so then at some point, we can just automatically recognize words for word level reading without having to blend sounds to read words. The next step, once I'm able to read a word, is what's the meaning of this word? So that's what it means by this linchpin or this central connection point. If we're not able to develop a deep and rich vocabulary, especially academic vocabulary or book or text vocabulary, students can really fall down at that point. And what that looks like when our students are reading, even if they can decode accurately or read words accurately, it's quite slow and effortful and laboured reading. And rather than reading words and joining the individual and collective meanings together to make sense of what they're reading, it's just this word by word approach where they go, okay, what does this word mean? What does this word mean? What does this word mean? And if we're reading with that word by word approach, or every kind of third or fourth or fifth word, we really don't know what it means, we can't make sense of it, we can forget being able to do those higher order reading skills, like piecing meaning together to read at a sentence level, piecing meaning together to read at a paragraph level. We can forget joining the dots and those more higher order skills. So I really want you to hold that in mind throughout this presentation, that word knowledge, vocabulary knowledge is the linchpin of reading comprehension, this central connection point. Importantly, students who have reading comprehension difficulties benefit even more from vocabulary instruction. So if you've got students who are poor readers across the primary years or across the secondary years with respect to reading comprehension, vocabulary instruction or intervention is a really great starting point. Remember, it's that linchpin, that central connection point. Starting with teaching vocabulary explicitly can be incredibly helpful. So I'll just read this quote and then we'll discuss it. Vocabulary training does increase comprehension for all students. In addition, students identified as having reading problems made more than 3 times the gains than students with no indicated reading problem. This pattern, however, was not the same with the vocabulary outcomes. Students with reading difficulties made equivalent gains in vocabulary knowledge as those without. So in this study, we've got 2 groups. So we've got a group of students with reading problems, reading comprehension problems, and we've got a group of students with no reading comprehension problems. They both have this intervention where they have explicit vocabulary instruction. They both make equal gains or equivalent gains in terms of developing knowledge of what the words mean. But this group of students with reading comprehension difficulties, on assessment of reading comprehension, demonstrated 3 times the gains than students with no difficulty. Why is that? So it goes back to that point I was making before, is it's almost like we're unlocking a level for these students with reading comprehension difficulties. If we can give them vocabulary, all of a sudden they can do a lot of other things that their peers without reading comprehension problems are already doing. So it's incredibly powerful as a starting point to boost reading comprehension for those who struggle. Okay, briefly, what is common practice? So this comes from the work of Karen Kindle, who went into schools and she observed teachers for 4 sessions a week across periods of 6 weeks during read aloud and shared reading lessons. And she had a particular focus on how they were teaching vocabulary during these sessions. And she found there were 3 levels of instruction. So teachers did one of these 3 things. They had incidental instruction, embedded instruction, or focused instruction. The category of incidental instruction meant that the teacher was infusing a tier 2 word. We'll get to the word tier shortly, but infusing a word into the discussion, either before, during, or after reading, but there was no direct teaching of the word. So incidentally, a new word was introduced. There was embedded instruction, and that meant that the teacher was paying attention to a word meaning, or word meanings plural, but there were fewer than 4 teacher-student exchanges. So there was really limited discussion as to what the word actually meant. And the final approach was what was called the focused approach. Now, what this involved was the teacher leading a discussion about word meaning. So it was a particular discussion about word meaning, but you can see here that those teacher-student exchanges varied a lot. So sometimes there were 4, but sometimes there were 20, sometimes there were 25. And you can imagine the qualitative difference between teacher-student exchanges about word meaning that happened 4 times versus those that happened 25 times. Imagine how deep and rich that discussion was. So those kind of 3 levels of how we can go about explaining word meanings to students. And within those 3 categories of incidental, embedded, and focused, she noticed 9 particular instructional strategies, which are pretty common in classrooms still today. So here they are. Questioning. So by questioning, it was just, does anyone know what this word means? Does anyone know what, propaganda means? Providing a definition. So propaganda means blah. Providing a synonym. So another word for propaganda is X. Providing an example. Clarifying or correcting a student's response. Extending a student-generated definition, labeling, imagery, or morphemic analysis. So again, you can see that there's a range of strategies that she observed, and they weren't really used in a consistent way. Sometimes the teacher might use questioning, sometimes the teacher might provide a definition, sometimes the teacher might provide a synonym. So this is what she concluded, that read-alouds and shared reading lessons are instructional events and they require the same advanced planning as any other lesson. And that relates to vocabulary instruction as well. We need to plan ahead of time which words we're going to teach, why, and how we're going to go about that. And she concluded that those 3 approaches, the incidental, the embedded, and the focused, as well as the 9 instructional strategies, did not go far enough in the type of the instruction or the duration of the instruction. And it's easy for us to, in the busyness of everything that we need to cover in the curriculum and the day-to-day literacy block or English block, it's easy for us to rely on more incidental approaches rather than explicit approaches to vocabulary instruction. So, incidental versus direct approaches, there is a place for both, but, and it's a big but. A single contact with a word will rarely lead to a student understanding and retaining a word's meaning. Students need multiple exposures in multiple contexts to develop rich word knowledge. So remember that. Students need multiple exposures in multiple contexts, usually over an extended period of time. Incidental or in context instruction gives us what's called fast mapping, which is contextually appropriate, but it's really superficial knowledge. So if you said that word again to me next week, I'll be like, yeah, I've heard that before. I've got a really rough or vague idea of what it means, but I probably won't be able to tell you much more than that. So I can comprehend it now, and it helps me to understand what I'm reading or what I'm doing now, but I'm probably not going to be able to understand it or use it later on. Direct instruction, explicit instruction, leads to slow and extended mapping. You don't need to worry too much about those terms. What that means is it results in deep knowledge. So I can comprehend it now and I'm going to be able to comprehend it and use it later in my speaking, use it later in my writing. When I come across it in a range of texts next month, next year, I'm going to have deep and rich knowledge of what this word means. So just an important note there, low progress or lower progress readers derive even less benefit from incidental approaches. So we're advocating for direct and explicit approaches. So having said that, a really good question for us to ask when we're teaching vocabulary in the context of a text is this: through my vocabulary instruction, am I facilitating comprehension in this moment only? Or am I facilitating word learning for comprehension now and later? So if we're relying on incidental approaches, so I'm going to give a synonym, I'm going to ask a question, I'm going to provide a definition in context, I'm facilitating reading comprehension, but I'm not facilitating word learning. That takes a lot more effort over a longer period of time. It's fine if we only need the student to understand the word in the particular context and we're moving on and we're not going to revisit it. Incidental instruction is fine in that context. But if we think it's an important word that they're likely to continue to encounter over time, that's when we need to think beyond that incidental instruction. So moving beyond incidental instruction, let's talk about robust vocabulary instruction. And this comes from the work of Isabel Beck and others. I've got some references and resources at the end that will fill the gaps in terms of people and references that I'm using throughout the presentation. So this is really the best available approach we have for vocabulary instruction. There's been a lot of research conducted into this approach. So it's useful and effective in terms of developing deep and rich knowledge of words, but it's so effective that it actually influences reading comprehension. So a robust approach to vocabulary involves directly explaining the meanings of words along with thoughtful, thought-provoking, playful and interactive follow-up. So here are the key elements. We select words and plan lessons ahead of time. Now, something I haven't included in there that's actually important, and we'll get to that. We need to select the text and to have read the text ahead of time too. So we're selecting words from the text and we're planning the lesson ahead of time. So there's no in the moment, I think this word's important. We've thought about it ahead of time and we've prepared the vocabulary lesson to embed it within our reading lesson. We make meanings explicit and clear using student-friendly explanations. We get students actively involved in thinking about and using the meanings in a variety of ways immediately after. And we review and expand upon what's been taught a number of times in speaking, reading, and writing tasks. That day, next week, next month. So we continue to revise, review, revisit. So the vocabulary tiers, there are three categories, three broad categories that words can fit into. We've got tier 1, common everyday words, and these words are usually naturally acquired. So through exposure in multiple contexts, through conversations with children, through conversations with parents and carers and teachers, we develop a really rich tier 1 vocabulary pretty early on. We don't usually need to teach those words explicitly to students unless they're students with developmental language disorder. They might have an intellectual disability or a global developmental delay. They might be students who are in the very early stages of learning English as an additional language. But generally, we don't need to dedicate time in our classroom instruction to teaching tier 1 words. Tier 2 words are what we call general academic words. So they're really common in written language, less common in our oral language. And students typically require explicit instruction in these words. So I'll put some examples there: analyze, proceed, auspicious. And tier 3 words are specific academic words. So they belong to a domain or a subject area. And they're common in context-specific texts, so textbooks, for example. And students will benefit from explicit instruction. So I'll put some examples there: epidermis, multiplication, species, isotope. So I'm saying we don't really need to teach tier 1 words. We don't need to worry about that except in particular contexts. What we need to focus on is teaching tier 2 words. That's the primary focus, but we also need to think about tier 3 words in specific subject areas. So why do we want to teach tier 2 words? Students don't just pick them up in everyday spoken language because we really don't use them very much. They're a more formal vocabulary and they belong in the literature rather than in our everyday talking and listening. Without Tier 2 words, students don't move or can't move or don't move very well from using everyday spoken language to becoming what we call a literate language user. And we want students as soon as possible within the school context to be literate language users, not just to be able to have conversations with you or with their peers. So I've said there, a barrier exists between everyday spoken and written or academic book language. Academic success is possible when students cross this so-called lexical bar, which comes from the work of Corson. So through teaching Tier 2 vocabulary, this general academic vocabulary, we're unlocking the language of books for students. So I've said here, written meaning, context, and the sophisticated vocabulary of written language is far harder to decipher than oral meaning or context. So text doesn't give us all the cues and clues that speaking or having a conversation with someone does. So there's no verbal, non-verbal cues. Words are more abstract, less concrete, and less imageable. I'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. So students are therefore less likely to learn or figure out word meanings well just through being exposed to them a lot when reading. They're harder to figure out. Tier 2 words are frequent in text. So remember I said we're unlocking the language of books really through teaching Tier 2 words. So we've got about 2,000 high frequency words that occur in books. They take up about 80% of what we read. So think about the, a, there, is, but, so, really common high frequency words. That's about 80% of what we read across most books. And that leaves about 20% of words that are predominantly Tier 2 words. That varies a little bit if we're having, if we're reading, say, a really domain-specific text. So if I'm reading a maths textbook or I'm reading a Year 11 chemistry textbook, that split is a little bit different. But just generally, if we're going to average it out over text, we've generally got about 1 in 5 words on a page belong to that Tier 2 general academic vocabulary group. So incredibly important to teach these. It's pretty disruptive to reading comprehension if you don't understand 20% of the words that are on the page. So knowledge of Tier 2 words is essential to reading comprehension and writing. And I want you to think of Tier 2 vocabulary really as a form of general academic background knowledge. When we're thinking about the knowledge we want students to bring to a text, Tier 2 vocabulary is a really important part of that. So why do we teach Tier 3 words? It's important for students to understand the key terms used in each area of study or the language of the domain. So the language of maths, the language of chemistry, the language of art, the language of music. So this contributes to the development of domain-specific background knowledge. So teaching Tier 3 vocab is therefore teaching that discipline knowledge. So again, incredibly valuable if we boost that knowledge in students. When they come to those texts at a later date, they're going to bring all of this deep and rich knowledge that helps them comprehend what's in front of them. So the role of read-alouds and shared reading, or the role of text more broadly. Reading and discussing text daily has been shown to improve reading comprehension and knowledge. So within that, reading comprehension, there's some divided schools of thought here, but more broadly, people tend to think that reading informational texts helps you to boost knowledge, and reading narrative text helps you more so to build reading comprehension, just because of the complexity of character and plot and narration, more complex syntax and sentence structure. So informational and narrative texts have really different structures, but we don't want to be that absolute or binary about it. Informational and narrative texts are both really important for improving reading comprehension and knowledge. So when done well, read-alouds and shared reading improve vocab, comprehension and narrative skills. Text reading and discussion is appropriate for narrative and informational texts. And my view is we don't spend enough time reading and discussing informational texts. Perfectly fine in Year 9 biology to read and discuss chapters rather than sending students off to do independent reading of a chapter and to respond to some questions. Perfectly appropriate to do shared reading or short bursts of independent reading with rich discussion and embedded writing. So students should be reading text and writing about the content across grades and subjects daily. So let's get into what vocab instruction can actually look like in the classroom. Step 1, we're going to choose and read the text. Step 2, we're going to choose the words we're going to teach from the text. Step 3, we're going to develop student-friendly explanations and plan the lesson. Step 4, deliver the lesson. Step 5 is retrieval practice, assessment and monitoring over time. I won't do too much on step 5 today. I want to focus more on planning and delivering the lesson. So choosing the text, I've said through curriculum mapping broadly across English, humanities, maths and science, but you can add a lot more to that, especially in the high school context. I've said to consider developing what's called a reading spine. So these are core texts that you decide as a year level team of teachers, as a discipline team of teachers. You agree on core texts that matter for building reading comprehension and knowledge. And the choice needs to be intentional and sequential. What that means is what I'm teaching in year 1 actually needs to be discussed with what someone's teaching in year 3 and what someone's teaching in year 5. We want to make sure we've got this gradual accrual of knowledge, but also with respect to vocabulary, I really want to know the texts that have been, if I'm teaching year 3, I really want to know the texts that have been taught in year 1 and the words that have been pulled out of those texts and taught, because I want to know what my students already know. I don't want to double up and teach them again, and I want to know how I can build on what's been taught. So what's really helpful if we think in a primary context, what are the most important texts for building reading comprehension and knowledge, and building your curriculum around that, and building a vocabulary scope and sequence around that. So we're mapping words to units of study or mapping words to particular texts to develop this vocabulary scope and sequence. So some key considerations when we're choosing the texts. Read harder texts is number 1. So in the early years, we're wanting to be reading texts to students that are preparing them for the difficult texts that are going to come later in their schooling. We want to be reading and discussing texts that they're not able to read themselves in order to develop and extend them. We need to read more non-fiction, not just relying on narrative texts in the primary years, because the expectation in secondary school is that students are able to read non-fiction well for comprehension, and we don't prepare them in the early years enough for that, really. We don't want to transition students to independent reading too soon. There's no rush. There's plenty of time to do read-alouds and shared reading before we transition students to independent reading. The texts we select, and within that, the words that we teach, are as important as how we teach them. We don't want to rely on levelling systems, and we want to expose students to the 5 plagues of reading comprehension. I'm going to get to that in the next slide. And expose students to a range of text forms. Within that, I don't mean just genre, I mean different text forms like poetry, essays, reports, textbooks, a range of text forms to get them used to it, articles and such. I'm not going to talk too much about that today. I am running some webinars if you're interested in May, more on reading and discussing text daily and what's involved in that, but just a brief consideration there. Okay. So I've just put, this is a draft document, doesn't look very pretty, but I'm just going to show you an example of what we've done at the school that I work in. So I've just taken a screenshot of our grade 5 reading spine. So this is how we've developed it. And the 5 plagues of reading, reading comprehension that I discussed before are listed at the top. So archaic language or classic texts, non-linear time sequences, complex narratives or complexity of the narrator, figurative and symbolic texts, comprehension resistant texts. The 6th plague of reading is really non-fiction text. But what we do at my school is we've got in each of those categories, the expectation is over the course of a year that staff will choose, we don't dictate all of the books, but staff will choose 2 books from each category to read across the year. In the earlier years, there's a lot more books that get read, obviously, because books are much briefer. In the later years, we're looking at a lot of chapter books. We're looking at novels, so we get through a lot less texts. And you'll see on the far right, we've got English, humanities and science unit text. So we've got read-alouds and student readers that go with our English, humanities and science texts. And I'll show you a bit more about what we've done with that with respect to vocabulary in a minute. Step 2, choose the words to teach. So choosing tier 2 words that have academic and social utility or words that have mileage. So we want to choose words that are going to be useful. By useful, I mean that students are going to come across these words over and over and over again, both in academic contexts, texts, So academic context, reading text, and then also in social contexts, or they might be more formal speaking contexts within the school setting. So we don't want to, as much as it's tempting, and I've certainly been tempted by this before, we don't want to choose words that we go, well, that's a really interesting word, or that's a really lovely word. We've got to teach words that have academic and social utility, because there's so many words that we could teach. We want to make sure that we're choosing the most important and the most useful. Want to choose words that students can conceptually understand. So just, especially in the early years, managing the complexity. Words they won't come across in everyday spoken language. Prioritise teaching words that are more abstract with what we call lower imageability. So the harder a word is to develop a picture of in your mind, the more important it is to teach. There's words, especially tier 1 words, that if I just say them, you can't help but develop an image of it in your mind. If I say a word like cat, a word like dog, or a word like ball, they're high imageability words. A lot of tier 2 words are really abstract, and they're really hard to develop this kind of image of or sense of in our minds. So we want to really prioritise those, because they're the hardest for students to figure out. Words that are more complex and difficult to learn through incidental exposure. How many words? Beck and colleagues say 2 to 3 per book, but that's in the early years when you've got shorter books. It's fine to choose, say, 2 or 3 words per chapter if you're reading a chapter book or a novel, or about 10 words per week. We don't really want to go over teaching 10 words per week, because it really limits how well we can teach the words. So we might teach more, but we'll teach them more superficially. And just a note there, books in the early years don't offer up good tier 2 candidates. Use the ideas expressed in the book or tier 1 words to generate tier 2 words to teach. So the example I often use is if you're reading a book and it's talking about the character is sad, that's a perfect opportunity to teach words like depressed or despondent. So thinking about how we can use the context of the story to actually introduce words that are not in the text if required. For informational text, in addition to choosing the tier 2 general academic words, we're choosing tier 3 words that are domain specific, that are key to understanding the text or the topic. So I've put in here some examples: integer, coefficient, reactant, and some others. So this is especially important, I think, in secondary school if we're teaching the maths subjects or the sciences, to go through and think about what are the words that are specific to this discipline, and how are we ensuring that students have a deep and rich understanding of these words. So again, this is just a screenshot of what we've done in the school that I work in terms of choosing words to teach. So we use for a lot of our content areas, we use the Core Knowledge Foundation curriculum, which you can look up online. It's a freely downloadable curriculum. So I've just got the first units that we're teaching in prep as an example, for English, for geography and history, and for science. So in English, the first unit that we teach for preps is nursery rhymes and fables. And this is our vocabulary scope and sequence. So these are the words that have been drawn from the read-alouds that are in this unit that we're going to teach explicitly. So this is quite a short unit, only goes for about 3 weeks. So the words that are in bold there are the words that we're going to focus on extensively. The other words will be covered, but it's more like an incidental instruction, whereas the words that are in bold is explicit instruction. In geography and history, the first unit in prep is one called Let's Explore Our World, where they go around the world and learn about different parts of the world. And all of those words there are taught explicitly. So this unit goes over a whole term though. So it's more like a 10-week unit, which based on the number of words there it's about 6 words a week that the students are learning and being taught explicitly and practicing. And then pushes and pulls is the first science unit. So those are the words that have been identified as really important for understanding the content and for building knowledge in relation to that topic. So all of those words are taught explicitly. And I think that works out again with the length of that unit. It's about 6 words are taught per week explicitly. And then there's additional words that are in a glossary in that unit that are taught incidentally. So we've done this for each unit of study across English, humanities and science. across each year level. So it's a great way of tracking too. Well, what are the words we expect children in grade 3 to come to us with? What do they already know? And they're constantly developing more background knowledge through learning words that are relevant to the topic, so tier 3 vocabulary, but also general academic tier 2 words. I've said consider using a word list to help guide you in your word choices. So just one example I'll talk about briefly is something called the academic word list that again is freely downloadable. A woman called Avril Coxhead in New Zealand developed this academic word list, and it's a word list that contains 3,000 words that are the most useful and frequently occurring words in academic texts. So she reviewed 28 subjects at university level, and she went through those texts in great detail, and she selected words for her academic word list that had occurred in at least 50% of the text that she reviewed. And so she's developed this wonderful resource that can help us understand the words that are going to be most useful for students to learn in order to read and understand the texts that they come across in primary school, in secondary school, and also at the tertiary level. So you can teach it in lots of different ways, or you can just use it to guide you when you're reviewing the text that you're already teaching. You can kind of go through and go, oh, this is on the academic word list. I reckon that might be a useful word to pull out of this text to teach. So you can go through, the 3,000 words are divided into 570 word families. You can teach by frequency or sublist. So she's divided the words into 10 sublists. So 1 is the most frequently occurring words in text, all the way through to sublist 10, which are least frequently occurring in text. They're still frequently occurring, but far less frequently occurring than those in the earlier lists. You can just choose a number of words to teach per year, or you can teach all 3,000 words. So this just gives you an example of what that looks like. There's the head word document. So for example, on the left-hand side, if you go down to the word access, which is 4 words down, you can see the number 4 beside that. That just means that there's 4 different words in the academic word list that have access as part of that word. So you might have accessed, accessing, inaccessible, for example. But if you're teaching just those head words and you're teaching morphology, you're incidentally teaching those 3,000 words. On the right-hand side, we've got sublist 1, which is the list of, I think there's 65 words in this list. This is just page 1, but it's the first list of most frequently occurring words in academic texts. So it's great as a resource to use to cross-check when you're deciding the words that you want to teach. Okay. Enough about that. Step 3, how to develop student-friendly explanations. So here are the steps. Look up the word in a few different dictionaries online or glossaries in informational texts. Hold in mind that dictionary definitions are pretty useless as a way to learn new words. So we don't want to rely on dictionary definitions. They're very brief. They can provide multiple definitions, and it's really hard for students to kind of make sense of competing definitions or to integrate that information. And because the definitions are so brief, it can actually mislead students and they can start using words incorrectly. So we don't want to refer students to dictionaries as their first port of call. And when we're creating student-friendly definitions, we want to consult a range of sources to ensure that we're creating the best student-friendly explanation we can. Consider definitions from the learner's point of view based on their age and stage. So we're trying to explain the word's meaning rather than just giving them a definition. There's a difference between those two approaches. A definition might just be 3 or 4 short, sharp words. An explanation is helping them to develop a real sense of what the word is and how it can be used. Consider how you could characterize, frame the word so meaning is clear. Consider everyday language that you can use to create the explanation. And then finally, create the student-friendly explanation, ensuring meaning is clear and explicit. So scripts can be really useful here. It's fine for you to write out the scripts of your student-friendly explanations and to read those directly out to the students. No need for ad-libbing. So step 4 is the actual lesson. So the pre-reading by you and the lesson planning has already taken place. So we're reading the text, questioning, students are active participants. The grey I'm not going to cover today. I'm just going to get stuck into how we're teaching vocab. So step 1, introduce the words and student-friendly explanations after we've read the text, and I'll get more into the rationale for that in a minute. We're going to solidify meaning straight away, take the words beyond the text, provide questions, reasons, and examples, get them to make choices about the word, get them to use all the words. Okay, so I'm going to go through those 6 steps now and what's involved. So introduce the word meanings. I've said here there's no need to introduce the word beforehand if you're reading aloud together. So pre-teaching, which is pretty popular, is not actually required. Pre-teaching can sometimes confuse students if they don't have the context of the word, the context of the text in order to understand the word. So a decontextualized definition, or providing the definition of multiple words at the outset of the text, can actually mislead and confuse students. The only time we really need to pre-teach is if you feel like the word will be really disruptive to reading comprehension as you read through the text. But that's facilitating reading comprehension. Pre-teaching is not about facilitating word learning. So the purpose of pre-teaching is only to facilitate reading comprehension in the moment. So you can decide whether you have to do that ahead of time or not. So I've said as an alternative to pre-teaching words that are disruptive to reading comprehension, you can provide a student-friendly explanation in the moment when the word is encountered, and then just move on. And then you'll do your explicit instruction after the lesson. So just say, well, X means Y, and keep reading. Once the book's been read and purposeful text discussion is concluded, introduce each word and the student-friendly explanation. So for example, in a lesson, I might be introducing 2 or 3 words. So how do we solidify meaning straight away? There's a few ways we can do this. The first way is something called word associations. So once you've provided student-friendly explanations, get students to associate the new word with words or phrases you present and get them to explain their reasoning. So I'll put an example here. If I had taught shuddered, hurled, and compel, I might ask the question, which word goes with through, or which word goes best with through? You can do something called describe a time when. So get students to associate the word with a range of context from their own experience, so they can see the word being of personal use or relating to their context. So if I'd taught the word compel, I might say, describe a time when you might compel someone, or when you might compel someone to do something. And then another activity, which would you rather, or when, how, why might you? So you ask a range of questions about the target word. So we're doing this straight away after we've introduced the student-friendly explanations. So if I taught the word encounter, I could ask a question like, would you rather encounter a grumpy parent or a grumpy sibling? Now, when I'm teaching this, I don't just accept the answer of grumpy parent or grumpy sibling. I need them to show me their thinking. Okay, otherwise I don't really know whether it's just like, it's just a choice, or just 50-50, I'll choose this one. They must provide their rationale. So I want to have them justify their choice to me. It's helping me understand how well they're starting to understand what this word means. So this section does require a bit of preparation. Step 4.3 is taking words beyond the text. So it is important that we don't just give a context-bound definition of the word. We don't want them just to think this word applies only in this context. We want them to know all of the ways that the word can be used. So I've said provide extended examples of the word meanings in a range of contexts. So if I had taught the word meaning for dazzling, and the context was in the story, Sylvia had dazzling teeth, straight away after that, I want to make sure that I give a range of other examples that weren't about teeth or necessarily about vivid colours. So I could teach about sunlight or the sun. I could teach about a diamond or another item of jewellery. But I could also teach a range of other things like the performance of an athlete or the performance of a member of the debating team. So that's more non-literal. So, wasn't that a dazzling performance? Or artwork on display, or something someone's made at school. What a dazzling display. So I've said there's some of the solidifying meaning activities do already do this, but it is important that we don't provide just that context-bound explanation. So take the words beyond the text. All right, questions, reasons, and examples. So I've just put a script here at the top that you're welcome to use. I just find it really helpful to have a script. So I'm going to ask you some questions about the words we've learned. I want you to use reasons and examples in your responses. So for example, which of these 3 things is impressive? Tell me why or why not. And then I'd list off 3 things. Again, I want to see their thinking. They need to justify their responses. Which of these 3 things is an example of solubility? Tell me why or why not. What is something you could do to encourage your peer? Why? What are some of the reasons why we might encourage our peers? So getting them to use reasons by providing examples. If you're holding a baby, you need to do it carefully. Why? What are some other things that you need to do carefully? So again, we're getting them to really think about it and demonstrate that thinking to us. Making choices, I'm going to say some things. I want you to tell me if they are examples of the word we are focusing on or not. So this is examples, not examples. If they're examples of the word, I want you to say that word. If they're not examples, you don't need to say anything. So if I had taught the word jubilant, okay, I'd say, okay, students, the word is jubilant. Say jubilant if any of the things I say would mean someone was jubilant or someone felt jubilant. And then I list off the examples. And sometimes students, when they're really developing a nice, rich knowledge of the word, will actually play around with some of this stuff. Sitting on a chair, for example, if they'd been doing something exhausting all day, they might say, oh yes, I felt really jubilant. And that's showing you, once they can start playing around with the meaning and being a little bit silly about it, that's showing you that they've developed that really rich and deep knowledge. Okay, and then finally, we're going to get them to use all of the words. So we have learned, for example, 3 words, might be more, might be less. We've learned 3 words today. Those words were blah, blah, and blah. I want us to think about them some more now before we finish the lesson. Again, this is just a script that I've made up to help me structure it. So you can get them to relate words. Ask students to share ways in which the words you've taught are or could be related using full sentences. Or ask a question using more than one of the target words in the question. So I've just put an example there. Would you prefer to disturb a sleeping dog or a ferocious wolf? Tell me why. Okay, so I've inserted 3 words there that we've just learned. Prefer, disturb, and ferocious. A couple of other things we can do. So choices, asking a question using an example and get students to choose between the 2 target words in their answer. So if you pack your bag the night before school, would that be sensible or complicated? Or finally, getting students to create their own examples. Ask a question to which they need to respond. If I told you I was feeling radiant, what might have happened? And they can come up with a range of examples for that. Why might someone be walking cautiously? They can come up with a range of examples. And you can cold call a lot of students to contribute to this and get a really diverse set of responses. Okay. Step 5, once we've done that lesson, and I'm aware that I'm rushing through this, but you can watch the recording again if that will help you. Step 5 is retrieval practice, and we should not forget retrieval practice, okay? Daily review, weekly review, monthly review. Just because we've taught something once, even if there's been multiple exposures in the lesson, it doesn't mean students have learned it. So review is essential to stimulating long-term memory and retention of vocab. And review is often absent or insufficient, which leads to students knowing the word now, which is just performance, but not later, which is actual learning. So I've just got a model here. This is really for primary school. Just an example teacher review model that you could try out. So teach, review, review the whole week, and just repeat that with a 3-week cycle. So every week you're reviewing a previous week. It doesn't necessarily, once you've taught it for a number of weeks, have to be the previous week. So in week 7, I don't necessarily have to review week 6. I might want to go back and review week 1. But it is important that we continue to revisit over a period of time, so our students don't forget what they've learned. As students get older, there's a few considerations there, but I won't dig too deeply into that now. I just want to show you a teacher review model for older students. So quite often we might be reading chapters, whether that's a textbook in a subject or whether it's a narrative text in English or literature. So I've put a bit of a different model here. So we could read a text chapter. So it might be just a few chapters in a lesson, introduce 5 new words, explain the text context, provide student-friendly explanations, create the word wall. Tuesday, we're going to do the remaining activities and then get them writing about it. Wednesday, more follow-up activities and get them writing about it. Another activity they can do is sort of start to create their own vocabulary workbook or dictionary that has lots of worked examples and a student-friendly explanation in it. Again, Thursday, more follow-up activities and more writing. And then Friday, you assess the knowledge from that week. So teaching 5 new words a week. You can do a few more than that, but don't really go more than 10 words because it gets too much for the students. So that's a model to kind of consider and try out. So I've said do some writing. So just briefly, and I am mindful of time, but I am nearly done. If you're using the writing revolution, I'm going to show you some ways that I add vocabulary in or make it a little bit more vocabulary focused. If you're not familiar with the writing revolution, I suggest becoming familiar with these techniques first before you start playing around with vocab. But if you're already using some of these approaches, you can start doing this straight away. So one of my favorites is using sentence stems with because, but, and so. So if I had taught the word enraged, because we'd studied a text where the protagonist, Emina, was enraged about multiple things throughout the chapter. Here are my sentence stems. Emina felt enraged because, Emina felt enraged but, Emina felt enraged so. And the expectation is that students will complete these sentence stems with words and then a full stop for punctuation. But that is going to show me how well they understand Emina's feelings. How well have they understood what they've been reading about? I'll put an example there with you, Reed. Reed was perplexed because, perplexed but, and perplexed so. What I just noticed before when I was getting this presentation ready is you can actually put, you can actually mix our sentence stems together. Emina felt enraged because Reed was perplexed. Emina felt enraged because, but Reed was perplexed. Reed was perplexed, so Emina felt enraged. Don't think there was any deep thinking behind that when I put that together. If you're teaching more in the higher years, you can start to put a couple of different words in your sentence stems. So if my students were studying a particular recession and we'd read an informational text and we discussed it, and I taught recession explicitly, I taught the word devastating explicitly, there's no reason why you can't build to putting 2 new vocab words in that sentence stem and getting them to demonstrate their thinking about that. Another one I like to use is sentence types. So the 4 sentence types being statement, question, exclamation, and command. So if we had studied the topic of tropical cyclones, so we'd read an informational text, we'd explained and understood what tropical cyclones are, what that means, I can then get students, after a lot of modelling, I can get students to create sentences that are a statement, a question, an exclamation, or a command about tropical cyclones, which is the topic we're studying. But I'm going to say, I've got 4 new words that we've taught in this lesson. Remember, we learned debris, forecast, catastrophic, and thoroughly. I want you to use one of those vocab words, one of those new words we've learned in each of the sentence types. You can get creative and extend students and say in some of them, but you don't want to distract too much from the writing element of the task, so don't get too creative with it. But you could get sometimes students to use more than one new word in their responses. But you could end up with something like, tropical cyclones leave debris behind. Who forecasts tropical cyclones in Australia? Tropical cyclones are catastrophic, or you could have something like, tropical cyclones are thoroughly catastrophic. Command, prepare thoroughly for this tropical cyclone. So you can start to, rather than just getting them to write generally about the content, you can start to bring in the words that you're focused on. Sentence kernels and sentence expansion. So you're starting with a kernel, which is the absolute bare bones of a sentence, and you want students to add the detail through the question prompts like when, where, how, what, why. If the kernel, the absolute bones, was this, Emina presented. If we thought about when, where, and how, in the context of this presentation. So when, well, we could say the date, we could say the time, we could say the day, where, on Zoom or online. How is a great way that you can incorporate your vocabulary instruction. So if I had taught enthusiastically, half-heartedly, coldly, or speedily, you can put in the chat which word you think applies to this presentation, probably speedily, hopefully enthusiastically, hopefully not the other two. But how is a great way to incorporate your new vocab? So if they're starting with that kernel, bare bones, Emina presented, you could come up with something like this. On Tuesday at 6 p.m, Emina presented enthusiastically on Zoom. So it's a way of getting them to use and apply the words that they've learned straight away. The last one I'll show you, I've just got a couple more slides, is a positives. So positives, it's a way of adding detail and depth to something that you've introduced. So a positive can be a noun phrase or a noun clause, and we insert that to either rename something that we've mentioned or to explain what we've mentioned in more detail. So I've put this one here. Read Ballarat is regional Victoria's most influential literacy community of practice. If we were to create a positive, so in this context, it would be to explain in more detail something about Read Ballarat. A scaffold I could give my students, or a prompt I can give my students is, okay, we've learned passionate, driven, and ambitious today. When you create your positive, I want you to ensure that you use just one of those new words that we've learned today. So you could come up with something like, you can have a go at doing them as well, but you can come up with something like this. This is quite a long one, but it still works. So Read Ballarat, a group for educators who are passionate about reading instruction, is regional Victoria's most influential literacy community of practice. So positives are a great way to start to embed that rich vocabulary that you've introduced to students about the topic, whether it's come from a text or a particular area of study that you're focusing on. Okay, I think second last slide. Going deeper, so I've said don't forget to do more structured word study. So we can introduce etymology, which is studying word origins, where they've come from within that particular root words. So I've said it's helpful to teach students that there are Anglo-Saxon, often tier 1 words, Greek, often tier 3 words, and Latin, often tier 2 root words. There are sound letter relationships and patterns based on word origin. So often the letter C is representing the ch sound, for example, in words from Italy. Often that CH digraph there is representing the sh sound in words with French origin. So you can explicitly teach the most common Greek and Latin roots. And there's really strong links to particular areas of study in the curriculum, like the sciences and maths have a lot of Latin and sometimes Greek roots in the words that matter for those areas of study. So you can develop a specific scope and sequence for roots. And don't forget morphology, so the study of internal structure of words. So teaching students how to look for units of meaning within a word, teaching students to segment words into root-based words and affixes, so prefixes and suffixes, and you can develop a scope and sequence for prefixes and suffixes to help them understand those individual units of meaning. So a nice quote there to finish that off. Students who understand how words are formed by combining prefixes, suffixes, and roots tend to have larger vocabularies and better reading comprehension than peers without such knowledge and skills. So I've said at the bottom, it's really helpful to link this type of instruction to your spelling instruction. Whether that your focus is on phonology and orthography in the early years, or whether your spelling focus after that is on morphology and developing all three together, it's really helpful to link that to your vocabulary instruction. So I usually suggest with vocabulary instruction in prep in year 1, especially when they're just developing their word level reading and spelling skills, that you just do your vocabulary instruction orally. We don't want to be teaching them complex spelling of words like description, analyze, before they've bedded down that foundational spelling. But once they've developed that code knowledge, you can start to incorporate written elements and reading elements into your vocab instruction. And just one point there at the bottom, note spelling ability can impact word choice when writing. So there's a couple of studies that have looked at, even if a student knows a word, they're less likely to use it. So if they're writing and they think, I'll use that word, they're less likely to actually use it if the spelling for it is difficult or not automatic. So it's important that we're thinking about this reciprocity of teaching words, but students also need to know how to spell them so they're confident using them in their writing. So in closing, robust, so within that, explicit and extended vocabulary instruction is a powerful tool for improving reading comprehension, writing, spoken language, and academic achievement more broadly. It's likely to be most effective when embedded across the curriculum in a structured and planned manner. So we think about which texts are we using and teaching, what are we teaching within them, why, how do we plan that across the years and within subjects. So instruction that succeeds in affecting reading comprehension includes 3 key features: more than several exposures to each word, both definitional and contextual information, and engaging students in active or deep processing extended activities, focusing on those words. And here's some suggested resources that will help you really develop and enhance your vocabulary instruction. But that is it from me. Thank you.
Emina, thank you so much. Can you, Ray, just give me a thumbs up if you can hear me? Okay. Yeah, awesome. So my job just after we'd finished was to field some questions, and we foolishly forgot to ask you before we started to feel free to type some questions into the chat. So I'll just say a couple of things, and then I would really encourage everybody, while we have Emina, I think we're all probably sitting here. That was about a day's PD in an hour, Emina, so well done. And definitely, I think anyone who's heard you speak before knows what they're in for. But as Reid said, you do have this magic ability to communicate really clearly and really well. So you've just, given us some fantastic information there. Just a quick reflection from me, and I'm watching the chat, so just waiting for hopefully some questions to come forward, was that I was in another session today, which I know there's some prints around the screen today, would have been where we looked at the declining percentage of students in the top bands of NAPLAN as we go from year 3 up to year 5, year 7, year 9. And we were just reflecting on, that space after we get children going, what does happen in those years 3, 4, 5, 6? And I think you've answered some of the questions there about what nuanced and expert teaching we need, both teaching skills and knowledge, to really help our children once they're strong decoders and they've got those foundations in place, where we go next to help them continue to produce or start to produce really complex texts and able to build their reading comprehension. Because certainly I've been one of those people that, we became very interested in the skills, and what we know now is that they were things that good comprehenders were doing because they had background knowledge and because they had vocab. And I think a lot of us are perhaps only just starting to realise the power of vocabulary teaching to impact both reading and writing. So I'm really excited about it. A couple of other things was, most things I've heard by now, but I highlighted this, the 5 plagues of reading comprehension. I had never seen that set out like that, and thinking of books to read to children that actually expose them to those particular challenges and deliberately choosing those books. And also thinking about the difference between a definition, providing that support with a vocabulary word while you're reading, which in that moment helps the child understand what they're reading, but isn't carried forward. So being really clear about that different definition of what we're trying to do at the time. So my probably quick question, although there's some people have made some comments in there, which is really good, is I suppose if you haven't started, I'm thinking that what would your advice be about that very first step? I've got a hunch that for me it would be not looking at content to start with, unless you haven't, because if you haven't got that ready, you possibly haven't got some vocab there yet to teach, but starting with a reading spine as a way of starting. Is that what your advice would be to a teacher or a school just wanting to start, tomorrow?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, Sue. And I think teaching any vocab is helpful, and it's a lot of work to design a program that's so structured in terms of the knowledge that you teach, selecting the vocab within that, and developing a scope and sequence across subjects or year levels. So I strongly suggest, and there's some really great free examples online, like you can look for the Australian DSF reading spine. You can Google the Reading Reconsidered reading spine. There's some primary schools like Leighton Primary School in the UK that has a freely downloadable reading spine. And just developing really high quality, a list of really high quality books that are going to expose kids to the complexity that exists in text and a range of different types of complexity, but are going to give you really good choices for vocab as well. So it'd be great to just, as a takeaway from today, go and pick some really high quality literature and have a go with some of the steps in lessons that I talked through today, and get familiar with what that feels like, because it's quite common to just have that kind of definitional or in context approach, but really having a go at planning out a lesson. But a reading spine's a great first step. Planning a curriculum is like 5+ years of work. So,
and teachers, the very first question teachers ask you when there's agreement that we need to explicitly teach vocab is, right, show me the words. What words?
Yeah.
What's the list?
Yeah.
Because, teachers are so time poor, and we have had a go at that, teaching tier 2 words, but they weren't connected to texts we were reading. So I'm just thinking about, the double sort of power of that a bit more.
That's right. Yeah, teaching in the context of knowledge, or whether it's narrative or informational text, is really powerful. Yeah.
And so then I should just look at the chat because they've popped in. So there's some nice thank yous in there. Shay's asked a quick question about handwriting. That's something a few of us have thought about. So whether you wanted to just touch on that quickly, Nina, about cursive or manuscript in P2. We've just moved from Vic cursive to the New South Wales font. We've closed our B's and P's over here.
I thought I'd be safe talking about vocab, not being asked about handwriting. You think phonics is controversial. Handwriting is very controversial.
Absolutely.
As well. Yeah. There's lots of strong opinions.
Friendships.
Yeah, but there's not necessarily the research to back up a lot of the strong opinions. We are using Vic cursive, but we're not teaching joined writing until about grade 3. I think the biggest argument is that most students in secondary school go back to manuscript writing anyway. Why do we teach cursive and joined writing when students don't stick with it? There is some research, and I don't think it's all conclusive, but there's some research that cursive with the join actually really helps with orthographic mapping. So the process of joining words together, sounds together, and actually blending to create whole words is more effective. But in terms of the actual font that people use, I don't think that we have enough information about that. The most important things are that we're focusing on legibility, posture, accuracy. We've got 10 or 15 minutes of practice, explicit handwriting practice every day. So it's like phonics instruction, that we want to develop it as quickly as possible to tick it off so students can actually do what we want them to do, which is writing. So the evidence is 15 minutes of explicit practice each day. But I'd say the jury's out as to particular approaches.
Yeah, I had read some of that research on cursive too, Emina. One go-to text from the books that you've got up there, Emina. Can you pick a favourite or a best?
The best one.
Now that you're in a government school, you know how tight we all are for money. So if we've got to choose one of those for our staff, which one would you choose?
I would choose Bringing Words to Life. What I've given you today is about a 2% overview of that book. But if you want to really dig deeper, the second book, Creating Robust Vocabulary, is more extended examples to their first edition of Bringing Words to Life. But Bringing Words to Life is probably the most helpful book that you can get on vocabulary instruction. That middle book, Unlocking Literacy by Marcia Henry, is great because it covers the relationship between spelling and vocabulary, because it lists all of the most frequently occurring root words and the most helpful root words to teach, and also prefixes and suffixes that are most helpful to teach. So if you're looking at joining that process up, that's a really good book as well. But if you're just looking at vocab instruction, definitely that first one.
That one, the Bringing Words to Life. And the next question you've probably answered a little bit, because that's what the reading spine is, some high quality Prep 1 books to teach vocab.
Yep.
Yeah, you would look at some of those books on that DSF.
Yeah. So I would suggest looking at some of those reading spine examples, and they're sorted based on more broadly on ability. It's not the leveling system or anything, but sort of more broadly on what students can do at each year level. I think that's a great starting point. And then some of those, like the Reading Reconsidered reading spine, sorts based on the 5 plagues of reading comprehension. So it's a good way of ensuring students are exposed to what they call pre-complex texts that are setting them up to read those complex texts later on.
Yes, that's something I'm going to Google pretty soon after we finish, because I'm not familiar with that. Another question here, which is a great one. As students at Docklands will be doing nightly home reading, is what part will vocab be in that? A vocab word sent home to practice?
Yep. Yeah. So in the first 2 years of school, we've got 2 books go home every night. So one's a decodable reader to practice what they're learning in Sounds Right, and the other book is called a shared reader that parents read to their children and discuss with their children. But as part of, because we use the Core Knowledge Foundation curriculum and we've got our vocabulary scope and sequence, some teachers are choosing to send home vocab homework. So these are the words we've learned this week. Here are the student-friendly explanations. These are words that you can kind of discuss with your child. And within that, we're kind of communicating to parents, well, this is what this unit's about. So they can actually have conversations where students are, it's almost like some retrieval practice at home. So students are sharing their background knowledge, the vocab, the context within which they learn those particular words.
Yeah. Amina, just another question for me. 10 words a week is a lot. Having taught myself as a teacher before I was a pre-in, had a little go at explicitly teaching words, and I found 5 a week was enough for me to manage. I'd be pretty impressed if someone was getting through 10. But I'm interested, because you feel like it's never quite enough. But I suppose what we have to realise is each word leads to a web of other words. We don't actually need to teach every single word, because there is a tipping point, isn't there, of, vocab knowledge sticks to other knowledge. So once you've got a certain level of knowledge, it does start to build on itself.
Yeah, that's right. And so the Bringing Words to Life authors and a few other authors also say it's more like, say, 5 words a week in primary, and then you can do more like 10 words in secondary. But when we say 10 words in secondary, that's across subjects. So that's not just what the English teachers are doing. That's what English and maths and science and whatever. So, it's across the board. And it's really important to have that cross-curricular approach as well to ensure consistency.
Yeah. Fantastic. Lots of thank
Read
yous.
That update you just put in is very exciting.
Yeah, and so Read, we're hoping, we will, our next presentation, it's sort of like a little extra one, because that team is obviously in America. It might be an early morning one and it mightn't fall into our sort of week 5, but he's a pretty well-known person that will share some information about on our Facebook page, so people can do a bit of Googling and finding out. So that's exciting, Reid. I'll be learning along with everyone else about the 5 plagues. Totally new thing for me today. Has anyone else got any questions? Reid's going to do a nice unmute himself, I think, and do a nice thank you, but I know how appreciative we all are. Amina, it was just extraordinary.
You're so welcome. And if you're interested, there's recordings of other vocab webinars floating around the web. Just email me. I know today was a really rushed version, but I've got more like kind of 2-hour versions around the traps, and I've written some blog posts as well. So if you want to do some more reading and not feel so rushed and like I've done a really superficial job,
I think a good
just get in touch.
yeah, our taster is a great thing, and we can share some of those because I know some of the people around the screen have been in the LDA sessions and things that I've been in and see them. Something I'll get a little plug in for now, Reed, is we're about our local stories session that we did in term 4 last year, where we really want to do that in term 3 this year to give people perhaps more of a chance to connect with each other, and hopefully we might even be in person, which would be amazing. So perhaps some of those teachers around the screen, might just think about putting their hand up and sharing some of their learnings from tonight and what they've been trialling in their own classrooms. We'd really love, because we're a very friendly group, aren't we, Emina? No?
Yes, you are.
Easy to present to, definitely. Reed, go for it.
Oh, just thank you very much, Emina. That was it lived up to its billing. It had a pretty high level that we built it up to, but it more than exceeded that. And we just want to thank you so much for your time this evening at the end of what is probably a busy day for you, and your willingness to share with us your experience and your knowledge so that we can be a little bit better in the service of the kids that we teach. And so thank you so much for your time tonight. We really appreciate it. And I think I speak on behalf of all of us that we've got notebooks that are chocker full of notes, as well as references we're going to have to check on a little bit later so that we can broaden our knowledge. But thank you very much, Emina. We really appreciate your time today.
You're very welcome. Thanks, Reed. It was great to be with you all. Who's the best person to send the recording to?
Probably Kathleen.
Kathleen.
Oh, yeah.
All right.
She's the tech girl.
I think the eyes have it there, Kathleen.
Yeah. I'll send a copy. I'll send it. It will just take a while to process on Zoom, but I'll send you a link to it, and I'll send you the slides as well.
Yeah, because I'm going to read through all that and watch that again. Definitely.
All right. Thanks, team.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you
Thanks,
very much,
Emina, so much.
Pleasure.
Okay.